She thought putting a simple lock on her cabin gate would finally bring peace. Instead, it triggered the kind of chaos only a power-hungry HOA Karen could unleash. Within hours, flashing lights filled the driveway as officers arrived, summoned by a 911 call claiming illegal activity. But here's the twist. My wife wasn't breaking any rules. In fact, she held a right the HOA never saw coming, one that would shake their grip on the entire community. So how did a harmless gate lock turn into a full-blown showdown that left Karen humiliated and exposed? Life at the cabin was supposed to be simple. Tucked beside a quiet lake, it wasn't a luxury mansion or a showpiece for the neighborhood, but for my wife it was freedom. Every weekend she drove out here away from the noise of the city to breathe in pine-scented air and hear nothing but the steady ripple of water against the shore. It was a modest retreat, a place built on peace, not problems. At first, the community seemed welcoming enough. Smiling neighbors waved from their porches, and the HOA presented itself as a friendly organization that kept everything in order. But beneath the polished newsletters and cheerful greetings, there was a current of control. Small notices slipped into mailboxes, subtle reminders of rules no one remembered agreeing to. For months it didn't matter. My wife planted flowers by the walkway, hosted quiet dinners on the deck, and watched her reflection dance on the lake at dusk. She believed she had found her sanctuary, yet even as she poured her energy into making this place her own, whispers of tension crept closer. A handful of neighbors eyed her cabin with suspicion, their attention sharper than simple curiosity. It started with questions about her driveway, then about the trail leading down to the water, and eventually about the very boundary between what she owned and what they claimed belonged to everyone else. She didn't know it yet, but her peace was about to collide with the HOA's thirst for control. And the smallest decision, a lock on a gate, would ignite a battle no one in the community would forget. At first, the HOA's interference came dressed as friendly reminders, a letter tucked under the cabin door noting that her gate was inconsistent with community aesthetics, a neighbor's casual remark at the mailbox, suggesting she keep her trail to the lake open for shared use. My wife brushed it off, assuming it was nothing more than neighborly chatter mixed with a dash of overzealous rule-keeping. But those whispers grew sharper. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this time typed on official HOA letterhead, stamped and worded with far less courtesy. Unauthorized modification of community access points, it read. They claimed her locked gate restricted collective enjoyment of lake amenities. The implication was chilling. Her private property was now, in their eyes, community property. She had purchased the cabin years earlier with clear deeded rights to that slice of shoreline. The lake access was hers, spelled out in legal documents, but the HOA acted as though paperwork meant nothing compared to their self-appointed authority. It didn't stop at letters. Soon neighbors began to watch. One man would slow his truck when passing her driveway, lingering just long enough to make his disapproval felt. Another woman accidentally wandered down the private path to the water, insisting she thought it was part of the public trail. Every encounter carried the same message: we don't think you belong here, not the way you think you do. And then came the fines. The first arrived folded into an envelope, $75 for gate obstruction. The second, $150 for noncompliance with community design standards. They stacked quickly, each one more absurd than the last. My wife hadn't attended the HOA's so-called meetings, because in her mind they had no authority over her land. But the board operated like a shadow government, writing new rules in real time and enforcing them with harassment disguised as procedure. By now, the peaceful weekends at the cabin were tainted. She found herself scanning the treeline for watchers, checking her mailbox with dread, and counting the days until the next petty attack. The sanctuary she had built, flowers, deck dinners, lake sunsets, was being poisoned by people who believed power came from intimidation. Still, she stood firm. She replaced the gate lock each time they tried to tamper with it. She mailed back the fines with a single word written across them: disputed. She refused to cave. That's when the threats escalated. One evening she returned from town to find a bold red sticker slapped across her gate: violation pending legal action. It was the kind of warning designed to shame, the kind neighbors would see and whisper about. And it worked. Within days, rumors spread like wildfire. Strangers began approaching her, asking why she was blocking access or whether she had permission to close the lake. Permission on her own property. But the breaking point came not with paper, not with whispers, but with sirens. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA with a voice sharp enough to cut glass, had decided enough was enough. She called 911, reporting illegal activity at the cabin. Her claim: that my wife had restricted emergency access to the lake by installing a private lock. Within minutes, flashing blue and red lights painted the pine trees. Officers pulled up, radios crackling, while Karen stood smugly at the edge of the driveway, arms folded, ready to watch my wife crumble. To her, this was the victory lap, the moment when the law would humiliate the woman who dared to defy her authority. But Karen didn't know the full story. She didn't know about the deed. She didn't know about the paperwork that gave my wife legal rights not just to the cabin but to the lake access itself. And she certainly didn't know that by dragging law enforcement into her petty crusade, she was about to trigger the one confrontation she couldn't control. The officers weren't hostile. They were confused. They asked questions, inspected the gate, flipped through their notes. Karen hovered nearby, tossing in accusations, demanding the lock be removed, insisting my wife was endangering the community. Yet the more she spoke, the more cracks appeared in her performance. Her confidence came across less like authority and more like obsession. Still, the damage was done. Neighbors gathered, whispering, pointing, watching the spectacle unfold. My wife stood in the middle of it all, heart pounding, humiliated by a lie she never invited. It wasn't just about a gate anymore, it was about dignity. About whether a group of entitled strangers could strip away her peace, her rights, and her ownership with nothing but noise. And in that moment, as the officers weighed Karen's words against the lock on the gate, the entire neighborhood hung in suspense. Would they side with her, the so-called HOA leader, or would they recognize the truth hidden in plain sight? The answer would change everything. That night didn't end with handcuffs or fines, but it did set in motion the showdown that would define the future of the cabin. Because Karen, humiliated by the officer's hesitation, wasn't done. If she couldn't win with rules, with fines, or even with the police, she had one weapon left, a campaign to turn the entire community against my wife. And she was willing to risk everything to see it through. Karen's 911 stunt should have been the end of it. Most people, embarrassed after dragging officers into a petty neighborhood spat, would have backed down. But Karen wasn't most people. When humiliation cut her pride, she doubled down. And this time, she wasn't just whispering in board meetings or slapping stickers on gates, she was orchestrating a full-on campaign. Flyers began to appear in mailboxes, neatly folded, printed in bold letters, "Protect our lake, stop the gatekeeper." Inside were half-truths, twisted claims that my wife was blocking emergency access, violating community agreements, and placing children at risk by closing off the shared shoreline. Each statement was calculated not to inform but to inflame. By the end of the week, neighbors who once smiled now turned cold shoulders. Conversations cut short when she walked by, some even muttered insults under their breath. Karen had succeeded at something more dangerous than fines or warnings. She had poisoned the court of public opinion. But what Karen didn't realize was that every step she took, every flyer, every baseless fine, every smug accusation was leaving behind a trail of evidence, and my wife had been collecting it. The breaking point came at the HOA's quarterly meeting held in the community center. Normally, these gatherings were tedious affairs, discussions of lawn lengths, parking rules, or the color of mailbox posts, but that night the hall was packed. Karen had made sure of it. She wanted an audience, she wanted a spectacle. As my wife entered, whispers rippled through the crowd. Karen sat at the head of the long table, papers stacked neatly before her, her lips curled into a smile that could cut glass. She didn't just want compliance, she wanted submission. The meeting began with routine announcements, but it didn't take long before Karen shifted the spotlight. She cleared her throat, tapped her papers, and launched into a speech dripping with authority. "We are here to address a serious violation," she declared, her voice carrying through the room. "One homeowner has consistently defied community regulations, endangered safety, and ignored repeated warnings. Despite our efforts to resolve this amicably, she continues to obstruct shared resources with a locked gate. Tonight, we vote on further action, including legal remedies and potential foreclosure proceedings." The words landed like a thunderclap. Foreclosure. Karen wasn't content with fines or shame. She wanted to strip my wife of her cabin entirely. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from Karen's loyal supporters. My wife's hands shook, but she stood. Her voice, steady but burning with controlled anger, cut through the noise. "Everything you've just heard is a lie." The room quieted. She held up a thick folder stuffed with documents, photos, and stamped legal papers. "This cabin is mine. This lake access is deeded to me. Every accusation, every fine, every so-called violation baseless, and I have proof." Karen laughed, a shrill, dismissive sound. Proof, your word doesn't override community rules. That was the moment my wife dropped the hammer. She spread the papers across the table, the original property deed signed and recorded, the survey maps highlighting the private trail, the county assessor's confirmation of ownership, and a letter from her attorney confirming the HOA's lack of jurisdiction over her land. One by one, neighbors leaned in to read. The room shifted, murmurs grew louder, but this time they weren't in Karen's favor. Karen's smile faltered. These documents don't change the fact that you've endangered. Endangered no one, my wife cut in, her voice sharper now. What has endangered this community is your abuse of power. You've issued fines without authority. You've tampered with private property. You've spread slanderous lies. You even misused emergency services to intimidate me. That's not leadership, that's harassment. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats. A man in the back whispered, "She's right." Another woman nodded slowly, folding her flyer with embarrassment. Karen, desperate, banged her fist on the table. "We are the HOA, we have authority over this neighborhood." And then came the blow she didn't see coming. My wife leaned forward, eyes locked on hers, and said, "Not over me, not over this cabin. And if you think otherwise, I'll see you in court, where every one of these documents will prove you've overstepped your bounds." The room erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, others muttered nervously. The power dynamic had shifted in seconds. Karen, who had spent months building her image as the untouchable queen of the HOA, suddenly looked small, cornered, exposed, scrambling. But the true humiliation came moments later. An older man, one of the longest residents, stood and addressed the crowd. "I've been here 30 years, I've seen HOAs come and go, but I've never seen someone abuse their role the way you have, Karen. This isn't about safety. This is about control, and I, for one, won't stand for it." Applause followed, first scattered, then building. One by one, neighbors who had once followed Karen's lead began to turn. The flyers that had spread lies now lay crumpled on the floor. The tide was shifting, not just in words, but in loyalty. Karen's face burned crimson. She tried to regain control, insisting that proper procedure required a vote. But when ballots were distributed, the results were undeniable. The majority sided against her. The motion to pursue legal action against my wife, overwhelmingly rejected. And then, almost poetically, a countermotion was raised, to investigate Karen's misuse of HOA funds and authority. Her empire had collapsed in real time, in front of the very people she thought she ruled. My wife didn't gloat, she didn't need to. The sight of Karen, slumped in her chair, papers trembling in her hands, was victory enough. The woman who once called 911 in smug triumph now sat silenced, stripped of the power she clung to so desperately. The climax of months of harassment had arrived, and it was Karen, not my wife, who stood exposed. But as powerful as that moment was, it wasn't the end. Because when someone like Karen loses control, they don't always accept defeat quietly. And what came next would prove that even humiliation in front of the entire community wasn't enough to stop her from lashing out one last time. Karen's collapse at the HOA meeting should have been the final chapter, a clean ending, with the community recognizing her abuse of power and my wife reclaiming her peace. But like many people who build their identity on control, Karen couldn't walk away quietly. Defeat only hardened her resentment. In the days that followed, she tried subtle retaliation. Cold stares across the driveway, snide comments tossed at passing neighbors, even late-night knocks on the cabin gate, childish pranks meant to unsettle. But those tactics carried no weight anymore. She had lost her authority, and the difference was stark. Where once the community might have joined her, now they kept their distance, unwilling to be pulled down with her. The board began its own quiet investigation, reviewing financial records, communications, and the long list of complaints Karen had weaponized against other residents over the years. What surfaced painted a picture of consistent overreach, petty fines, selectively enforced rules, and questionable spending that seemed to benefit her more than anyone else. It was all laid bare in black and white numbers. By the end of the season, the board voted to remove her from the presidency. She wasn't expelled from the community, not yet, but her crown had been stripped. For someone who thrived on status and authority, that loss was almost worse than exile. She was still there, still visible, but powerless. For my wife, the change was immediate. The mailbox stopped filling with fines, the gate remained untouched, Neighbors, once hesitant to even make eye contact, began stopping by with quiet apologies. Some admitted they believed the flyers at first but now saw Karen's tactics for what they were, intimidation wrapped in bureaucracy. Others simply said, "You stood up for yourself in a way we couldn't." It wasn't just vindication, it was transformation. The cabin, once tainted with dread, slowly reclaimed its identity as a sanctuary. She planted new flowers along the walkway, brighter and more colorful than before. She repainted the deck railings not because the HOA required it but because she wanted to. Each stroke of paint, each bloom of color felt like reclaiming ownership not just of the property but of her peace of mind. Yet the true impact wasn't just personal, it rippled outward. The community, emboldened by seeing Karen fall, began to question the HOA's broader practices. Why were certain rules enforced and others ignored? Where exactly did dues go each year? What other residents had been quietly bullied into compliance out of fear? For the first time, people spoke openly and without fear of retaliation. The board, recognizing how close they had come to imploding under Karen's reign, instituted reforms. Fines required clear legal standing. Rule changes demanded full community votes. Financial records became transparent. It wasn't perfect, HOAs rarely are, but it was progress. And it all began because one homeowner had refused to yield over a simple locked gate. But for all the changes, Karen remained a shadow on the periphery. She still lived there, still watched, still simmered. She tried small acts of defiance, writing anonymous letters, planting rumors, but none of it stuck. She was no longer the voice of authority. She was just another neighbor, her reputation forever scarred by her downfall. For my wife, that lingering presence was a reminder. Victory doesn't erase scars. There were still moments when she glanced at the gate, half expecting another violation notice. Still nights when she replayed the flashing lights of police cars in her mind. Trauma lingers even after triumph. But over time, the fear dulled, replaced by something stronger, resilience. And perhaps the most satisfying consequence wasn't immediate. But long-term, months later, Karen put her house up for sale. Whether she left because of embarrassment, loss of power, or the shifting tide of the community no longer bending to her will, no one knew for certain. But the day the for sale sign went up, it felt like the final page of a long, bitter chapter. When the moving truck finally pulled away, neighbors gathered on porches, exchanging looks of relief. Some even toasted quietly as though a storm had passed. My wife didn't celebrate loudly. She simply walked to her gate, closed it gently, and locked it, not in defiance, not in fear, but in peace. And that's the impact of this story, the realization that sometimes the battles we never wanted to fight become the ones that reshape everything, not just for ourselves but for everyone around us. One person's refusal to bend exposed corruption, restored